Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Today, we'll talk about the transformative power of civic engagement. Professors Tim McCarthy and Gretchen Brion-Meisels share a deep commitment to civic engagement. Today, they'll talk about its inextricable connection to individual and collective transformation, particularly at this moment in history. And now, without further ado, let's discuss the transformative power of civic engagement. Tim, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all of you inviting Gretchen and me to participate in this conversation today. This is very much going to be a conversation. This is not going to be a lecture, no presentation slides, PowerPoints. We're going to power our own points. Gretchen and I are, as was noted in the introduction, are deeply committed to civic engagement and also to transformation and power, I suppose, and we'll get into that. We've known each other in different ways for over 2 decades, and I'm a historian, and so historians measure generations in decades, and so what I'll say more loftily right now is that Gretchen and I have known each other for over a generation, and now we're colleagues and at the Graduate School of Education, where we co-conspire and teach and do all sorts of things. So it's wonderful to be here, Gretchen, with you. For all of you who are logging in today and zooming in, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to go back and forth. We've come up with some questions and some things that we want to focus our attention on. And we're just going to do that for a little while. And then when it feels right to pause and to invite everyone who's here into the conversation with us, we'll do that about halfway through the session. And then we'll just kind of, answer your questions and engage your comments and thoughts. And we look forward to that. So Gretchen, let me start with this. We'll both engage this question, but let me ask it of you first. When you think about civic engagement, right, it's a word that has many meanings for many people. What do you think about? How do you define it?
Hi, Tim. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. So this is an interesting question because fundamentally, when I sat down to think about what is civic engagement, really to me, what it is it is individual and collective decision-making around trying to create or engage in the world around them in some way, right? Which can be around transformation or can be around resisting transformation, but it's some level of decision to act or to engage. But I decided to go and figure out, okay, what are other people? Let's go to the literature and see how other people are defining it. And I thought it was super interesting that the American Psychological Association defines civic engagement as individual and collective actions designed to identify and address issues of public concern. And that was really interesting to me because the individual and collective action part really resonates with how I think about civic engagement. But the notion that it only happens in moments of public concern, for me, falls short of a broader way in which I think civic engagement actually happens in moments of public possibility. And what I mean by that is that often we are responding in moments of civic engagement to things that we see that are unjust or wrong or inequitable. But just as often, I think we see people coming together or even individually engaging through the process of visioning and dreaming and imagining. And so for me, civic engagement is really a way of thinking about democratic participation. And I don't mean in a sort of political sense, but in the broad sense of what does it mean to be an individual in a part of a community, nested in a set of communities, and choose to actively think about how your behavior and language and inaction even is impacting the folks around you, and choose to actively consider the way in which anything you do, even if the choice is to do nothing at all, has a consequence. And it has a consequence at both an individual level and a collective level. And so I'm thinking in this moment about civic education or civic engagement as something that is super broad and that is inextricably linked to transformation, because really the idea that underlies it for me is that there is no such thing as neutral, and time is always moving and things are always shifting. So whether or not we shift toward a more just society, or we choose to regress, or we choose to stay the same, all of those things are political decisions in some way, and our decision to engage with them actively is our civic experience, right? But it's not so much defined for me in political terms. And so I'm actually curious how you think about it and how you define it and what you would add to that.
Yeah, so I love all of that, and the two things for me that stick out are the sort of neutral, that nothing's neutral, right, and the possibility piece, right, which is also, we might frame that as aspirational, right, the idea that something else could be, and that we could make something else, something different, hopefully something better, not always necessarily that. And the neutral piece, of course, stands out for me. As you know, one of my late mentors, Howard Zinn, wrote a memoir called "You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train," and the point of that is that all of us, each of us, always are situated in history, and that history is always moving. That whatever the arc is that we happen to be in the midst of is shifting, and so we have to be mindful of that. And when it comes to civic engagement, I think one of the impetuses for people to be engaged civically is because they see something that is not right or that is wrong and decide they want to change it, right? So you vote to get your candidate elected, or to shift parties, or to shift power, right? You volunteer because you don't think that people should be homeless or hungry, right? Or on the fringes of society. That so often our civic engagement is motivated by a sense that there's something that's not right. Right, and that we want to repair that, we want to fix that, we want to do something about it. And so this idea of, we can't sit on the sidelines, we can't be neutral, right? That those are untenable and actually irresponsible. And that gets me to another way that I think about civic engagement is it's a kind of responsibility to something bigger than yourself. Even if you do it as an individual, right? I volunteer at the shelter, or I vote in every election. That may feel individual, but it's for something bigger, right? It's for people who are in a place where they need to come to a shelter, right? And it's for a different kind of political regime or political community in that way. And I agree with you that thinking about civic engagement more expansively than just as a kind of political practice or political engagement, although it's that too, right, is really important. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think sometimes when we talk about civic engagement, I think it feels like it's a course on civics. It's some kind of like mandate or requirement. It's some way to kind of like participate in the system that already exists. And I would love, and maybe we can dig into this a little bit more, to think about civic engagement again more expansively, so that we're actually including people who are not okay with the system, right? Who are, as you said, resisting it, right? Speaking truth to power, right? Yeah. How does protest, right, or organizing or movement building fit into a conception of civic engagement that I think is often thought about or imagined very narrowly about volunteerism and voting? Right, and thinking about those as part of it, but that it's much more expansive in that way, and it includes practices of public service or volunteerism, and it includes more radical ideas about justice and redistribution and reparation. Right, we can get into that, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Let me just say one quick thing about what you just said, which is that there's this interesting divide that I've never totally fully understood in the world of civic education between civic education and action civics. And action civics is like externally oriented, sort of like education around service or justice, but like something you're doing. And to me, that's always been a confusing divide, because those two things seem so linked to me. And so this notion that if we broaden the definition, it forces us to ask ourselves, first of all, it forces us to confront the fact that what each of us might be imagining as the world we're trying to build, the democracy, the society, is not the same. So we can be civically engaged, and we can both and be at odds with each other, right? And we're both still civically engaged. And it also, I think, forces us to confront from an educational perspective, this notion that there is no such thing as a political education, right? That everything is political in its own way, to the point about Howard Zinn. So those 2 points really resonate for me.
Yeah, something that came up in what you were saying. Not to be super provocative or so early in our conversation, but
Please.
can we think about the Black Lives Matter movement and the insurrectionists on January 6th as both being involved in civic engagement, right? Not to equate them or to bring in a moral false equivalency. And I'll just be very clear, I'm much more aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement than I am ever with the insurrectionists. But, could you say that both of those kind of moments and movements are engaged in civically in that way, whether for good, bad, or everywhere in between? And so I think it raised one of the things that's, I think, challenging or risky about a really expansive rather than very specific or localized definition of civic engagement is, does that then become an umbrella under which everybody can kind of exist? And then we have to parse out what it means and what they're doing and why and what kind of impact they're having. But I think maybe it's a good time for us maybe to pivot a little bit to how we came up in the world, right? That you and I have known, as I said, for a generation or more. We're now colleagues, which is thrilling and wonderful, and I love every minute of that. But thinking about how you grew up here in Cambridge, and I grew up in upstate New York, and we both came to Harvard as undergraduates. And so, how has your sort of origin and evolution story, as I like to say it with my students, contributed or shaped your sense of this? And then I'm happy to share that as well.
Yeah. Well, you are an important part of my origin and evolution story, but I will start long before that part, which is to say that I grew up in a family. My mother's family were Holocaust survivors, and my father was raised Catholic and didn't associate with a lot of the parts of the religion, but I think very much associated with the parts of Catholicism that are more around liberatory theory. And so I feel very lucky, actually. I did nothing to deserve or get this myself, but in that I grew up in a family where there were constantly questions being asked about what was just and what our role was to play in that justice. So I was constantly being asked to think about my own identity, constantly being empowered to think about how I might take action or how I was impacting other people in my actions. And I also often talk at the ed school about how now in my mid 40s, I can look back and realize that I went to the public schools in Cambridge in the 80s, in a moment when we were kind of at the height of desegregation, and when people in Cambridge were really committed to thinking also about issues of justice and issues of inequality. And so I benefited from both those things, and I benefited from the fact that my family and my school were somewhat aligned in the kinds of things they wanted me to think about, which is not true for most young people. So for me, in a lot of ways, the notion of being engaged, being an engaged human being, and thinking about the purpose of my existence as contributing to, in some way, the ongoing trajectory of history, like the quote about the arc of what is it? You know better probably, but the arc of justice is long. Of history is long, but it bends toward justice.
Arc of the moral universe, yeah.
That's right. So that was a very central part of my childhood. For me, the more challenging piece has been, since adolescence, really thinking about what does it mean to be civically engaged and to believe in the fact that I have a role to play in my own individual and our collective transformation as a white cis woman with educational privilege, right? What does that mean? And that has been a really hard question for me. And I would say there was a span of time between 15 and 21 where I was almost incapacitated by that question. I really wasn't sure how to think about the fact that I both needed to act, and I knew that any action I took would be taken from a place of privilege and would have consequences in the world. And the thing that started to help, I haven't figured that out, but the thing that started to help me think about that was this project I did as an undergrad, which was my senior thesis. And my senior thesis was really a personal project more than it even was an academic one. And what I did was I managed to get some funding to go interview white folks in the South who had been active in the civil rights movement in the 1950s, which was before it kind of became like cool for Northerners to go South. But these were folks who had really had to sacrifice significantly to be actively involved as white anti-racists or as white aspiring anti-racists. And that started to provide for me a model of like, okay, what can civic engagement look like? And what does it mean to be engaged as an individual who's a member of a community that has a certain amount of power and privilege and wants to act, but doesn't want to act in a way that harms other people, right? And that I feel like is a part of this question of civic engagement that I continue to grapple with. But you, as you know, but the audience doesn't, have been instrumental in helping me with that, because at that moment, my senior year of college, you came in to help me untangle some stuff around that project, and then helped provide me with a model of a white person who was doing the work. And so I think since then, I've been really very aware of and looking for models of folks who are engaging in ways that are conscious and careful of their positionality, but also acknowledge and take responsibility for, to use your language, the role that we each have to play in the need to move toward a more just world.
Yeah.
So
I love that. And let me just say that, I'm also looking for those role models. Right. I mean,
yeah.
I mentioned my late mentor, Howard Zinn, earlier, right? Howard was one of those people, right? That was in that community of white folks who were part of the movement even before the movement became the movement, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things about history that I love is that, the things we look back on and call these kind of grandiose things, which richly deserved in that case, right? They started in local places, right?
Mm-hmm.
With acts of real radical courage, right? And obviously Black people in the civil rights movement who were the engine of that struggle and always have been, but also white people who chose the precious few, and then over time more and more who chose to be part of that. And I remember, your senior year was my first year teaching at Harvard, and I had returned to Harvard because I become the legal guardian of a young kid that I had mentored through Phillips Brooks House when I was an undergraduate, and I became his legal guardian and helped to raise him as he came up through the Cambridge public schools where you went, right? The very schools where you were and your parents and your community have been very active. And so, I met you, and at that point, I didn't realize, I will say I didn't realize exactly what it meant to have mentors who are younger than me. We always think about mentorship as like the elders, the ancestors sort of passing on. But one thing that we know as teachers, right, as educators, is that we're nothing if not shaped by the young people in our classes, right, who come to us for education, but also give us that. Like, we learn as much as we teach in those settings. And which gets back to you, I don't know that I was looking for someone like you, right, a student who was deeply invested and intentional about thinking about race and privilege and power, also about history, and specifically about whiteness, right? How whiteness as an identity, whiteness as a structure of power and privilege, whiteness as a kind of ubiquitous norm. And you were doing that work at such a young age in ways that I gave me language, frankly. So, I know that you talk about what I did to help shape your trajectory, but you also shaped mine, right? And the idea that there were students like you who were doing really radical work, not embraced and welcomed by everyone by any means, but that's the whole point of it, right? To do work that pushes and provokes and pops open, right? Some new possibility. And you were that kid when you were a kid. And now to be colleagues after 20 years, and for me to move as I'm doing this summer from the Kennedy School to the Ed School, and to have an opportunity for us to really do this deep work in another kind of act is really inspiring to me. And, it's interesting because one of the things that I have thought about in terms of civic engagement. Right, I grew up in a family that was privileged and not privileged. Right, I talk all the time about, you know, my bio says I'm the adopted only son and grandson of factory workers and public school teachers. Right, that's a very deliberate part of my bio. It's more important than my degrees and my books and my, you know, whatever else is there that you have to put up on a Harvard website. Right, but that is so important to me because I started out being adopted, which means that you're both alone and also embraced, right? That whoever brought me into the world, you know, for whatever the reason, didn't want me, right? But someone else did, right? And this idea of being thrown into a kind of place of loneliness, and, you know, there, but for the grace of God go I think about that blessing and that luck all the time. I call my parents the jackpot parents because I feel like I won the lottery. But then to be invited into a family that they wanted to be much bigger than it was, and be the kind of you know, the target, the focus of so much of that energy of these immigrant stock grandparents who worked to the bone in factories, my grandmother who was a trailblazing educator and leader in her community, and my parents who were both public school teachers, to have all of that kind of energy located, you know, in me, right? Because there weren't any other kids and grandkids, right? It was like there it was. So there was a lot of pressure there. But what my folks gave to me is that, you know, I had certain kinds of privileges. My mother always said, we have enough money to have dinner together every night. She used to say that all the time, right? And that this idea that we would gather, right, as a family. And the thing that was so important, they were also Catholic, they were also social justice Catholics, devout in that way, working class people, but also white people, right? Also, you know, in some cases, educated folks. And what they gave to me in terms of civic engagement was the sense that, you know, don't be an asshole, right? You know, work as hard as you can, try to get as much as you can, but don't expect anything as an entitlement, right? And you know, they talked about losing as much as winning when it came to sports, and how important losing was, right? And how important it was when you did have something, whether it was a little bit extra food or a little bit extra money, right? Or more power and privilege, that you had to give that and pay it forward. And so for me, the idea of civic engagement as a project that involves in some way a kind of resistance to embracing the privilege and power that comes from, you know, as you said, whiteness or middle classness or education or what have you, that it was never about getting that and keeping it and hoarding it. It was always like getting it so that you could do something with it to make the world a better place, to redistribute power, to open up doors and open up access. And that was modeled for me all along the way, not just from my parents and grandparents, but through the professors that I chose to study with, and also the students that I've been blessed to teach, and then now the colleagues that I've chosen to spend my time with for as long as I'm here in this incredibly weird and privileged place, but one that also, I think for you and I, you know, pushes on us to figure out how we could be.
Yeah, so can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I think that's really interesting. When I think about you, and also when I think about a lot of the other mentors and folks I admire in the world, white folks and also many, many, many people of color and queer folks. One thing that I think about is what it takes to get from the step of don't be an asshole to the step of I'm going to actively lean into my courage around speaking up for what I believe is morally, ethically just, right? And I think that in this particular historical moment, one of the things that I hear in, and maybe I'm making this up, but in the subtext of what a lot of organizers are calling for is that move. It's like, yes, you can sit around and talk about civic engagement or anti-racism or anti-oppressive behavior and not be an asshole, but really you're still living in ways that reify systemic inequity. And what we need in this moment is for you to actually find both the courage and the conviction to reject some of your privilege or to stand up to other folks with privilege, and sometimes more or equal privilege to you, and actually take risks around imagining and creating a different kind of space. And that's something that, as long as I've known you, which of course, you were already in your mid-20s when I met you, like, you've done. And so I'm curious, in your own journey, can you think about how you found that conviction, and like what has helped you always continue to act and to take responsibility in that way?
Yeah, and I want to ask you a follow-up about getting from kind of theory to practice, because you do that about as well as any colleague I've ever met. And so I want to get back to that. But I think what your question is getting at is a little bit about that, like how we live in the world, not just how we think about the world, right? I mean, that I think it was Marx. I'm probably going to mangle the quote, but the idea that the point is not just to interpret the world, but to change it. Right. And so far as that's I'm definitely a Marxist. I was trained in that way, that there's a responsibility for us to try to figure this out and then to go do something about it. Right. And that's at the core of at least my idea about civic engagement. And I think some of it comes from I was raised by courageous folks. I really was. I was raised by people who were not afraid to be outliers, who were not afraid to be, to choose to not be affiliated with power, but to be, as Brian Williamson says, proximate, right, to the pain and the suffering and the struggle and the injustice. And I that was sort of in the bones of my family. But, I also think that history helps with that, right? You historical sensibility. One of the things that I say all the time is that, we're just a little piece of this big thing, right? That almost nothing is unprecedented in the world, right? There's, if you're good enough and diligent enough, you can always find some kind of precedent to help you understand and put in context what you're going through now. And so for me, having that long and deep view of history is really helpful. Right, particularly in this moment and in moments like these, in a culture which is all about immediacy and urgency, and also like, this is the thing, and then we're on to the next thing. We don't even remember the thing, and it was 2 minutes ago. Right. And so for me, I'm always trying to slow down and zoom out and put things into context. And so being a historian really helps. And for me too, I mean, this is what you did in your thesis. You were searching for role models in history, right? Elders and ancestors that could help you make sense of the life you wanted to lead. And that's exactly what I was doing too, right? My early work was on the abolitionists. And people were like, well, why are you studying abolition and not slavery? I'm like, well, you can't study abolition without studying slavery, or vice versa. But I wanted to study the people who won. Right. I wanted to study the people that, like, literally, talking about an American Revolution. Right. Like, the abolition of slavery and the liberation of 4 million Black people who were extracted and exploited and stolen and denied everything. But they came together with some other folks and actually undid that system, right? And then created a political, legal, social, political, cultural architecture that would promise something completely different from the broken promises of the founding, right? I want to know, how did they do that, right? And so I've always been drawn to those people, and those are the people that inspire me. It's not the people that, like, maintain the status quo. Yeah. Right? One of the things that got me into some trouble on a routine basis at the Kennedy School was, I was always trying to ask those questions. I wasn't interested in entering into and preserving power, right? What I'm interested in, how can we empower? How can we liberate ourselves from these institutions, including this one, right? Including Harvard, right? That are set up. They're not of us or by us or for us. We're here now, right? You and I. Yeah. And so many of the people who are here, right, were not originally imagined as being part of this. Same thing with the United States or any kind of nation state that's premised both on promises that are elusive and dreams that are deferred, but also, right, deep systems of inequity and exploitation and extraction. Right, we have to confront that. And for me, like, that's what history does. It gives you an engine and an understanding, but it also is the thing that allows you to really ask the questions that need to be asked, right, of the institutions and the systems within which we all live, right? And at the end of the day, right? We got one shot at this. I'm not someone who believes in reincarnation, for better or for worse, but we got one shot at this. How are we living our lives? If I perish tomorrow, right, what did I do today? Right? Did I go to a bunch of meetings? Did I fill out a bunch of reports or memos? Or did I ask a question that opened up the possibility for something more different and more just and more equitable? That's what it does. And you do this with our students. You do this as well as anybody I've encountered on the faculty here, which is taking, and you have a deep theoretical and intellectual academic historical understanding, but you are always pushing us to ask those questions that push open, right? These possibilities. So how do you do that? How do you take this like deep intellectual work that you've done and that you have, and then push us in the direction and yourself at the same time? That's the thing I love most about you, is that you're always also modeling the messiness of what it means to take theory and put it in practice. How do you do that?
I think a huge part of that for me is listening to my students and listening to other folks who often are not the voices that are being held up or amplified by dominant society, but who have perspectives and voices that allow me to continue to see things that I haven't necessarily been aware of, right? And so I'm just thinking about, for example, a very concrete moment this year, right, where one of the things I teach is a class on critical participatory action research. And so that's sort of about researching in community in a way that's critically oriented. And at the beginning of the year, often historically, or often in that field, things get framed as like, well, we're going to come together around identifying a problem and fixing it, right? And I had a number of students, predominantly students of color, who really pushed back on that this year, who said like, no, we don't want to just come together around problems. We want to come together around possibilities. We want a chance to like dream collectively. And honestly, I don't feel like I knew how to do that, right? But what I did know how to do was to listen for long enough to be like, okay, there's something to that. I'm missing something in the way I'm thinking about this. And I need to cede power enough that I can understand what they're saying and make room for this way. And in fact, many of the projects that leaned into the collective dreaming were among the most powerful. They didn't necessarily look traditionally academic, although some of them did, but they were powerful in the way that they refused to start with a set of things as they are, right? They refused to say, here are the parameters. Instead, they said, if we could have any parameters, what would they be? And so for me, that sort of shift, the fundamental thing is to be open to listening for me. But really, I find myself really shifting and having to push back on both urgency and speed, which you named, right? And the sort of desire to do things quickly or to do things right, which is very ingrained in me from Harvard and other institutions. And instead, like really slow myself down and ask myself, like, what else might I want to understand before I do this? Or what are folks trying to tell me about this? Or what does it mean to do this collectively? And you didn't put it this way, but in listening to you, one of the things that really struck me is that I do feel like, I'm not sure exactly how to talk about this, but I do feel like there is something different about civic engagement for the collective good and civic engagement for the individual benefit, right? And this goes back to that first question you posed, which is super provocative, and I don't have a clear answer to it. But one thing that feels really different about the insurrectionists is that the focus of the engagement is on increasing their own power rather than thinking about a sense of collective well-being. And to me, that feels like it matters, right? So that's just some thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't raise that provocation to sort of equate or to.
No, I know.
I'm a rejecter of moral false equivalencies. But the idea that you bring up about the insurrectionists and why that was something that I think we have to reject and denounce explicitly and ongoingly, alas. Is precisely that. It wasn't just that they're trying to increase their power. Absolutely. They're trying to preserve their power. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was a white supremacist insurrection.
Right.
I mean, with the Confederate flag and so forth. I mean, was there a person of color in that crowd, or non-white person in that crowd? Not from the video footage I've seen. Now, what does that mean, right? And it's not just about increasing the power of whiteness and white people and white supremacy. It's about preserving, right, the long-standing power of whiteness and white people and white supremacy. And the thing that I think is so powerful and treacherous about this particular moment is that these folks who engaged in that are framing themselves as the victims, right? They are articulating a set of grievances, right? That somehow their jobs are being taken and their admissions are being undermined and their sort of power and rights and all these things are being taken away because of all of these other movements that we've been part of and that we are still part of and that we've written about and that have influenced our thinking, that have actually opened up a much bigger, more capacious, messy, right, multicultural, right, democratic, small d democratic world, right? And that's what they're reacting to. And so, so how do we think about civic engagement and be specific about when it's for good and when it's for ill, right? When it's to preserve and amplify power and when it's to share it and redistribute it. But I think those questions are really really important. And one of the things too that I think is again something you do that I gain inspiration from, but it's tricky, right? And it's particularly, you're a queer woman, right, at a school, and neither of us have tenure, right? We're precarious in certain ways here, and yet we're of the institution in terms of being alums and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's a weird thing, right, to feel like totally on the inside and also like really on the margins in some way. But what you do really well, and I think it's a kind of radical vulnerability and transparency that you model, which is to say, look, I don't have all the answers, right? And maybe my answers are wrong. Maybe my questions aren't even right? And that's where listening to our students and being guided by them is so important. And I share that commitment deeply. I don't always do it as well as you do, but I think it's important. But what does it mean then, right? And this, as faculty members, as teachers and educators, what does it mean to like resist our own expertise? Like, both of us are pretty smart. We know a lot of stuff. We have degrees, all those things, but we don't know everything. And I know this because we're dear friends as well. We spend a lot of time like questioning everything that we've learned, that makes us experts, that's gotten us our jobs and kept us here. And yet at the same time being able to say, look, I may be an expert on this, but maybe like I don't know what I'm talking about in this moment of reckoning, this moment of history, right, which is calling us to a kind of radical accountability and I think a kind of more expansive sense of possibility, right, the freedom dreaming that you talked about, right, a more liberatory idea about what we can build and what we can do in the world. That comes with great risk, right? Especially for those of us who are not tenured, right? And who study the kinds of stuff that a lot of people are like, that's not really serious or rigorous or academic. And yet at the same time, we continue on because it's really important for us to do that. And more students are looking for those spaces, right? To ask that, where they can, they can teach us something. And I think that when we talk about advances in learning, right, I think that has to flow in multiple directions. And I think you're really, really good at that. But like, do you feel that that's risky or radical, or is that just kind of who you are?
Yeah, I am aware. I want us to open up to the audience because you're reminding me that there are other people here. but I don't think, I guess it's risky. And I know that I have a ton of privilege in being able to risk that, right? Like I don't have a fear for my fundamental survival needs, and that allows me to take those risks. But to me, it's also incredibly liberating because if I think about history, right? One thing that I know is that whatever I think I know in this moment, it's going to be looked back on and people will have a whole different set of ways of making sense of it. And everybody is making sense of it differently, even in this moment. And so rather than me like holding on to that expertise for dear life, which felt really terrible. Like I did that the first couple of years I taught at the university setting because I thought I was supposed to. And I was so uncomfortable and miserable, right? And I don't think my students loved it either. And being able to say to myself, like, you know what? It goes back to, I think, your question of like, if we don't live long, if we die tomorrow, right? If I die tomorrow, it's how I am in the world. How my friend Thomas used to say, it's how we be that matters, right? And so that's about how I want to be. And I'm much happier taking the risk to be in a way that feels humanizing and connective and relational than I am holding on to that expertise and sort of being on a treadmill that I don't even really believe in. So, but I do recognize that there's privilege in that risk for sure.
Amen. I'm going to co-sign all that. Yeah, let's open it up to the Q&A and discussion.
Fantastic. So these are questions that are coming in through the Q&A function, which we encourage you to use, as well as to upvote other people's questions. I'm going to start off with a very interesting one, and it goes right back to the beginning when you're parsing your terms about civic engagement for decision-making versus for action. How can civic engagement be leveraged to help bring together people who are on opposite sides of the ideological divide? How can we center things that unite us as Americans to smooth over the sharp edges of ideological difference? And Gretchen, maybe start with you and then put it over to Tim.
So I actually have been thinking about this over the last 10 minutes. I don't know if I have the words, but I'm going to try and maybe Tim can help me. And I started thinking about it when we started talking again about civic engagement in the context of like really hateful, white supremacist behavior. And that is terrifying. And I don't want to call that civic engagement. I don't believe that that's civic engagement in any real sense of that word. I do think, though, that if we want to be able to think about relationships and engagement as helping us move forward and heal to some extent as a country, part of what can help us do that is to get below the what people want and get to actually like, what are we afraid of? What is happening underneath it? So one of the things that theory on systems of oppression suggests is that one thing that many systems of oppression or moments of oppression have in common is that the oppressors are really in conflict with themselves, but they make it seem as if it's about the other, right? And so they have to control the other in order to keep themselves safe, but actually it's a conflict in and of themselves. So I see part of that conflict as like, I am deeply afraid of my own ability to survive and my own ability to thrive. And I feel unempowered. And absolutely, we need to speak out against and actively stop people from acting that fear out in that way, right? That's not okay. And also the fear itself for me offers more possibility around what it means to move forward than the sort of like what the demands. At the demand level, there's not much I can see of value. But if I can get below the demand level, in this particular case, even though I don't agree with the political orientation, I can start to understand the fears, right? So that's not super well worded, but that's something I've been thinking a lot about is like, what are the questions we need to ask each other to try to get to a space where we can understand what our human needs are and then say, okay, the needs might be valid. The how you're thinking about it is completely unokay. So how can we reconstruct this? The same way I would say to an 8-year-old, or I would say to my son when he has a temper tantrum, like, your desire to do X is valid. You can't do it that way, right? So we have to think about that. So that's not a great answer, but that's sort of where my brain is puzzling through things in this moment.
Yeah. Right. So we're talking there about understanding and sort of perhaps figuring out what's okay and what's not okay. Tim, what do you think?
So I thought that was very well worded, Gretchen, actually, and it helps me think more deeply about this. I think that the key to our survival as a country, right? And I'm not like someone who's deeply invested in like the nation state as like a category of ordering things, although it's what we have and where we are. But or just as human beings who live in a world where all of us are marked by all these differences, right? That we have to get over the impulse to unity, unanimity, and this like romantic view of the past as some promised land. It's not, right? We have always been a mess because we're a motley multitude, right? Even the 13 colonies were not unified, right, in all of the things that they thought about or debated or dreamt about with respect to the new nation. That was a very limited cohort of people who shared all sorts of power and privilege in common, right, to say nothing of race, gender, class, etc. And they were at odds with one another. History does not move by consensus. And so I think there are, especially in times like these where we feel very divided, where we are very divided, right? Where politics is deeply polarized, where people on opposite sides of a particular issue view the other in terms of disgust, right? As opposed to difference, right? And I think that, you know, but we've always been that way, right? I always say to people, when people say, we've never been more divided, I'm like, have you read the congressional debates about slavery in the 19th century? Like, have you read the Constitutional Convention minutes, like, or the pamphlets of the American Revolution or whatever, right? We've always been divided and polarized. It's how we do the work of trying to reckon with those differences, not always reconcile them, right? And turn them into similarities. But to say, hey, you know what, we are different. And because of that, we're positioned in the world in different ways. We have different material realities, social realities, political realities, etc. And because of that, we have different worldviews, right? We see the world differently, right? And I think that it's the question is not to just get along, right? The question is to understand why we don't, and that we never have. And that to me is the starting point. And in some ways, you know, maybe not exactly the end point, right? But it certainly gets us further down the road than I think we are when we trade in these sort of, you know, romantic fictions about some kind of, beloved past, which never really existed if we understand our history. And this is at the root of, I think, so much of the opposition to critical race theory or African American history or LGBTQ history, anything that disrupts the kind of master narratives, right, is seen as a threat, because people have this idea that we were better until we were all fine until this stuff came and threatened it. Well, the reason why we have this stuff is because all of the difficulty and the difference and the disruption and the division has been erased, right, from the way that we understand our past. So I think that for me is really important. We can't even talk about getting along until we understand why we don't.
So then let's take that a little bit further, particularly for the teachers in our audience, understanding history, for example. What is the role of teaching civic engagement in civic education? Is one part of the other, or are they really taking us in different streams? Tim, I'll start with you.
I mean, again, it gets back to the idea about civic engagement as a more capacious sort of, understanding. And I think that, we can think about what our kind of responsibility to others is in a public, right, or a civic space. But I also think that we have to understand the constraints and the boundaries of what we consider to be public and civic. And so for me, civic education, right, as a kind of pedagogy that produces a practice of civic engagement, has to be able to contain both the ways that we work within the system, right, or give our consent, right, of the governed, and also the ways that we speak truth to power back at that system, the way that the dissent of the people. I mean, to me, it goes back and forth. I always talk about this in my protest literature course. For years, I taught a course called American Protest Literature from Tom Paine to Tupac, and I talked about the Declaration and the Constitution as being these an act of dissent, right? The Declaration of Independence, for all the critiques we can have about who wrote it and how it and what it did and didn't do, was a written act of civil disobedience, right? It was a dissolution of things. It was to alter It was to abolish what was there. And then the Constitution is a much more conservative document. It creates the institutions and the laws and the norms and the regulations within which we operate. So it's about consent, right? And to me, that tension, right, between dissent and consent and the responsibility of both of those things, right, in a civic way, is what I think we should be wrestling with. And so for me, when I think about civic education, it's not to say, okay, kids, this is what you got to do, this, and this. To me, it's like, how do we understand the tension between this idea of consent of the governed, right, and the dissent of the people, right, within a framework of a community, which is, you know, I think a less highfalutin understanding of what a nation is. It's an imagined community, and one that is, you know, always emerging and yet to be achieved. Gretchen, what do you think?
Gretchen, do you take a similar view? I mean, again, how does one teach civic engagement, and what is its role within civics or something else?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think my view is similar, although I would talk about it more as a teacher, maybe, and less as a historian. But I feel like I feel like all young people, children, even really, really little children and young people, deserve to have the experience of learning in a school setting in a way that allows them to come to understand the world around them more deeply. So in that way, I very much believe in Freire's way of thinking about teaching as something that can be liberatory if it's done in a way that really helps us become aware of the structures that are shaping our lives, and then also the ways in which we can take agency within those structures. And this notion of praxis, the idea that we act on the world in order to learn about it and then reflect on our actions, also feels very central to civic engagement for me. That part of what's happening in that act of civic engagement is that we, no matter how old we are acting on the community and the world around ourselves, learning about that, and then making new decisions or coming to new understandings about it. I do think that there's a deep danger in civic education that does not address issues of structural inequality. And so what that would mean, I think, is sort of what Tim was implying at the beginning, which is like that we teach students about how the government works as if that's not a problematic or questionable function, right? What I want is for us to teach young people the history, and like the actual history, not just the history that hasn't been erased, but also unearthing the erased histories, right? And then to give them the power to say, okay, I want to try this, or I want to adopt this understanding, and then we're going to actively reflect on that together. So what's interesting to me is that I think often when I say to people, I believe that we need to educate about systems of power and that all education is political, there's this immediate resistance, like you're indoctrinating children. And I see the reverse, actually. I see that as empowering young people to have all the information they need to be able to figure out how they want to orient to the systems around them. If we erase half the history and then pretend that the other half is just like a given, that's indoctrination, because we're not giving them all the information, right? So for me, really, if civics is going to be done well, if it's going to be done in the way that I want to be a part of it, then it is about civic engagement, not necessarily because I'm telling you have to engage, that's your choice, but because I'm giving you the historical knowledge and the structural knowledge to be able to analyze what's happening and choose how and where to engage, because we're all engaging all the time. But I think that is aligned with Tim's version. It's just more in a teacher speak.
Yeah, I love that.
It's very useful to think about the dangers of complacency as its own indoctrination. That's nicely put. This is going to unfortunately be our last question, but I think it's one that speaks very closely both to what we're just talking about and to your own backgrounds. What advice would you have for a teenager looking to become more involved in our government and democracy? We're joined by many members of Harvard Summer School in this conversation, so maybe you can address it to them. What advice would you have for a teenager? Gretchen, I'll start with you.
I would say, this is a great question. I love this. In a lot of ways, I think you probably know better than I do what the most important issues are and what the best ways to act fact are, because you are the only person who's in your own sort of position in the world. But I would say, like, believe in your voice and really, like, remind yourself repeatedly, even when you're told not to, that your voice and your perspective matter. That's one thing. I would say, like, really lead with a stance of curiosity and listening, and try to learn as much as you can from the people you interact with, rather than thinking that you have to do the teaching. I think that no matter how old we are, we always have learning to do. And in the stance of learning, we can actually build in a way. And then the third big thing I would say is, like, find your people. You know, nothing good happens when we do it alone. Things are always better when we work in community, and often, especially when we work in community where there's disagreement, because the disagreement is what leads us to generate new ways of being. And so figure out, like, who are the people you're going to situate yourself within, and how can you lean on those people to help yourself grow, and then to work on growing the community around you.
Interesting. So you're making a distinction there between finding a community and isolating yourself with people who already think like you. Very good. Tim, I'll turn this over to you. Some more advice, and I guess it'll be our last words.
I love that last point that Gretchen made, which is, you know, I say to people all the time, find your herd and build your squad. You know, and you know, I just turned 50 this summer recently, and I was just home back where I grew up in upstate New York in Albany, and I was at my friend's 50th birthday party, because all of us are turning 50 this summer, and we were in her backyard, and we were with a group of friends, 6 of us who we've known each other for 4 decades, and have been through everything together. All of the mess of the arc of our lives we've experienced, and, like, I know in my bones that those folks, because they've always been there, are always going to be there. And so finding your people, right, and, you know, find your herd and build your squad is one thing I would say, and do that intentionally. Like, one of the things that I think about all the time whenever I talk about these friends from home, right, and I have very, you know, long-standing deep friendships with folks from where I grew up and also college. People always say, "Oh my God, that's so unique," or "That's so." I don't keep in touch with anybody from when I was younger, and I always feel like that's so sad, right? Because those are the folks who can finish your sentences and revise your stories, right? Who will always hold you accountable, and that's really important. And so when I say that Gretchen and I have known each other for a generation, like, that carries weight for me, right? I know that this is a colleague who is dear to me and deep to me, right? And I hope to play that back. The other thing that I would say is that, and this gets back to the idea of civics education and civic engagement, is don't worry about fitting in. Right? Your aspiration to be normal and to be accepted and to be part of this is totally human and totally understandable. But we spend so much time, right, diminishing and downplaying the things that make us extraordinary, right, for the sake of fitting in, right? Whether that's trying to get tenure or get published or to be popular or to have power, get elected, right? So often, right, we diminish the misfit qualities of our identity in order to fit in. I think, as someone, you know, Gretchen and I are both LGBTQ identified and part of a queer community. And one of the things that I have gained from that is to know that, like, normal, right, is oppressive, right? To be queer, to be a misfit, to not fit in, right? To come into your own power and to be truly liberated, right? Should be the thing that we're striving for. And you know, as I get older, the more I realize, like, how much time it took me to realize that if I had figured out it was totally fine to be queer when I was 18 or 19 or 20 years old, right? How much freer my whole life would have been. I'm glad I got there now, and we're living in this particular moment. But that's what I would say to the young folks out there. It's like, just be a misfit and lean into that. And it's okay, because we're out there for you, right? We can be your herd and we can be your squad. And for me, that's at the core of any kind of life, and also any kind of teaching.
Very good. Thank you both. This is very inspiring. Thank you, Gretchen and Tim. And thanks to all of you who've joined us today. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events. Good night, everyone, and thank you for engaging in this conversation.